Welcome to Democratic Television, a program of the Santa Clara County Democratic Party that brings insights, perspectives, and attitudes of our always thoughtful Democratic guests. Today we're joined by Cindy Chavez, the Executive Officer of the South Bay Labor Council. And Cindy, welcome to Democratic Television.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
One more time.
One more time, yes.
Well, a lot has happened since the last time you were here. That's probably something we could say every month as the world turns. Before we get into that, you're the executive officer of the Labor Council. You've been there for a while, but you have a past. You grew up, have a family, went to college. You know, a lot of interesting and traditional things. So what in all of that was motivational for you that made you want to be a warrior for justice?
A warrior, I love that. You know, it's funny, and if you think about what's happening in the world right now and just, you know, what's happening in the Middle East and what's happening in Wisconsin, and you think of all these places, there are a lot of warriors that are emerging, that are really trying to put their voice and their imprimatur on history, right? And this is the time for history making. So it's an exciting time to be in the labor movement, and to be a democratic activist, to be a community leader. As I think about it, I think I didn't know that there were options. Like growing up, I didn't know it was optional not to be an activist. And so it was something that my parents were really involved in the community. My dad, I think you've heard me say this, was a union carpenter who some days hated his union, some days loved it. But he knew the importance of being part of a community and the power that came from that. And so, you know, and I knew growing up, when we had health care, my dad was working union jobs. When we didn't have health care, you know, he wasn't. And so I think I grew up believing that all of us needed to do our part, and that being an activist was part of being just being a person.
So you've had a number of different jobs as an organizer, Democratic Party organizer, I always love to mention, union organizer. You've done organizing and confidence building for organizations across the world. Do you feel like you made a difference, that you had people go, okay, I'm gonna stand up and make a difference?
You know, we all hope so, right? We hope that we create the opportunity for other people to rise and to be part of making a change in their own lives. And when one of the things that I did is I was a volunteer for this organization called the National Democratic Institute. And one of the pieces of work they had us do was go to the Ukraine, and we were working with NGOs and trying to help them understand how to get more people involved and in being volunteers. And when you come from a society where everything was compulsory, then it changed, and people didn't really know what it even meant to be a volunteer. Well, it was fascinating. I mean, I learned a ton and ran a couple of workshops. Well, while I'm there, the main city we're in is a city called Ekaterinburg, which is a sister city to the city of San Jose. So I'm giving this presentation, and I didn't know it at the time, but I'm giving this presentation, and it's being translated simultaneously. And this guy raises his hand in the back of the room, and he says, in English, broken English, he said, "I know Susan Hammer, do you?" And for your viewers, Susan Hammer was mayor of the city of San Jose and created this Sister City program.
Yeah.
And so I think, you know, Susan helped them think about that city, think about its future in a different way. There were a lot of young women there, and at that time I was a much younger woman, that I think were excited to see another woman speaking out and being in front of the group, because we had a lot of women who were trainers from the American team. There were not a lot of women presenters from the Ukrainian community.
So that's what we really needed, more people that can get out there and say, I'm like you can do this, to break people out of their molds and to say, I'm gonna make a change. I'm gonna be a Barbara Boxer and end up being a U.S. Senator and making major decisions and influence.
That's exactly right. And I think that's particularly important now, because in some ways, you know, with all that's happening in the world, people being prepared to stand up and not just act, but have a construct to think about why they're acting. And if I think about this work in the Ukraine, just to go back to that for a minute, one of the women there said to me, "There's a group of women that want to meet with you," and the other another American woman, after the workshops are over. And so I got into this room, and my interpreter explained this to me, and we got into this room, and there were all women there and one man. And the man said, "You are not allowed to have this meeting." And I didn't, I was getting this translated, and I said, "Well, I don't understand why we're having a conversation about what it's like to be a woman volunteering. I don't understand why that's offensive to you." And he said, "This is an unauthorized meeting." And I said, "Well, then I think you need to leave. If you feel uncomfortable about it, you should leave." And then he said a bunch of things that the translator didn't want to translate. He was very angry, and he slammed the chair down, and he looked at the women, and he said, "All of you, this is unauthorized." Or he said something like that was very threatening to them. And I said, "Well, you need to leave." And then me and this other woman who I was with stood up, and she's very tall, and so he got angry and he stomped out. And after we left, the women were all just smiling, and my interpreter said, "I don't think I need to interpret this for you." I said, You don't. So every stone that you unlodge, it's almost like freeing people's souls to be everything that they can be. And in some ways, that when you think about democratic principles and you think about what our founding fathers were trying to think about, then it was really, how do you get the maximum potential out of every person? I mean, then I think they obviously thought it was mostly geared toward men, but we now understand one of the shortcomings of their thinking was that you need a whole society to free it.
Yeah, very good. We had a great election in 2008. We elected Barack Obama. We didn't elect John McCain. We brought a real sense of hope to the world. It feels to me like some of that has been lost, and the 2010 election didn't bring that same enthusiasm. As a result, our people didn't turn out. Our candidates lost. We lost the House. We were weakened in the Senate. What do you see, based on some of the stuff we just talked about, some of the recipe for getting back to 2012?
I mean, I think the first thing we need to do is within the Democratic community, and I think this is true for the labor movement as well, we need to be willing to have courageous conversations, because in some ways, and I've heard a lot of people say Barack hasn't done enough, President Obama hasn't done enough for this, he hasn't done enough for that group, he hasn't done enough for this group. And in some ways, I think we forget that how people get power isn't just that they're elected, it's that you have an activist base across the country who are supporting that person. And what's fascinating to me is the Republicans lost, they licked their wounds very quickly, and then they got back into Washington and acted like they'd won. And they used every trick in the book to stall, to delay, to negatively impact. I mean, if you think about it, the fact that they fought to stop people in this country from having access to health insurance, I mean, that should be alarming no matter what part of the country you live in. But they were creative, and they were clever, and they were willing to stir it up, and they were willing to frighten people into action. And so one side of the aisle, came with action. I mean, and then our side was, I don't know what we were doing, like in our rooms being intellectually thoughtful about whether or not this healthcare plan was enough of what we wanted. And I think in some ways, Democrats, and I think people who believe that the society can and should be something better and different need to stop talking about it and start acting on it, because we've created the middle in this country has gone so far to the right because the left and the progressive community have been so silent, and we've let the middle just sit there. We've let the middle be dragged to one side. If you think about it, I tell people this all the time, but you think about President Nixon, one of the best presidents we ever had on the environment. A Republican. I mean, and history is littered with Republicans who've acted more progressively than our most recent Democratic presidents. And I don't think it's just the presidents. I think it is the time they inherit, and we need to play a role in that. What does that mean? It means volunteering. It does mean blogging. It does mean helping people see the world for what it is, because our opposition has gotten so good at telling the same lies over and over and over again till they become truth. And then we're developing these 20-page policy papers about why their lie is a lie, instead of just saying, that's not true, this is truth.
Well, the other glaring statistic that I see is how the middle class is actually shrinking. The haves are getting more, the have-nots and everybody else are getting by with a lot less, and yet people aren't standing up in alarm over that because the Republican sound machine is doing so much to disingenuously throw people off their game.
Right, and I also think in this country that we have a lot of underpinnings, a lot of Puritan kind of underpinnings to our thinking today, and one of them is that if you're poor, you deserve to be poor, and if you're wealthy, you deserve to be wealthy. And let's just look at Meg Whitman running for governor. There were a lot of people who ascribed a lot of power to her because she was wealthy and she was a strong businesswoman. And so there was an assumption that A, she was a good businesswoman, and she may well have been, but B, that automatically transferred into being a good governor. And there were a lot of people who just sort of said, oh yeah, government can be run like a business. Most of those people don't run businesses or government, so I don't think really know that to be true. But if you think about what gets ascribed to a person because they're wealthy in this country, it's just astounding. And the same happens with people who are poor. And what that means is that if you make public policy based on believing that people get what they deserve, you make very flawed public policy.
Well, that's unfortunately a great point. The other sad point, I think, is that people who aren't doing so well aspire to be like those other people that live in glamour, that have media attention, that seem to have a great life, although many times we see that unraveling, but that's a different issue. So we're going to take a little break right now. When we come back, I think we need to talk a little bit more about Wisconsin, San Jose, real world stuff.
Looking forward to it.
Good. We'll be right back.
Hello, I'm Larry Stone, the Santa Clara County Assessor. Politics, particularly Democratic Party politics, has always been important to me. The office of County Assessor is technically a non-partisan office, but I've always been proud to call myself a Democrat and be involved intimately with the Democratic Party. When I was growing up, my parents taught me to be involved in giving something back to your community, and I've been able to do that through my involvement in the Democratic Party. As assessor, I look at myself as a fiduciary for schools, local government, cities, redevelopment agencies, and I think it's important to let people know that I'm an active Democrat. So if you're interested, please give us a call at 408-445-9500. And thank you very much for watching DTV.
Welcome back to Democratic Television and our guest, Cindy Chavez. Cindy, thanks for staying.
Thanks for locking that door.
Yeah. We were talking about motivating and getting people involved and standing up and owning the government that we have. Things haven't gone too well. Again, we mentioned 2010 was not a great year. Lately, we've been going through the scourge of Wisconsin politics. How would you define Wisconsin politics? What does that mean to your average person? Or what should it mean?
That's an excellent question. And let me start by saying what I think the Republicans have been brilliant at. The attacks that they've had on the environmental movement, on the labor movement, on Planned Parenthood, on women's right to choose, means to me that they're looking around and saying, who spent the most money against our folks? Who's got PACs? And how are we going to put them in their place so we don't have to deal with them in the next election cycle? And that the reason that's so critical to understand is there are philosophical differences certainly between, some Republicans and some Democrats and probably some independents around the role of government and a woman's right to choose and what is our obligation or our rights related to the environment. And there's a kernel of that veracity that gets used to further a political agenda. And what's important to remember about the reason I want to point that out and why I think it's so critical is that when we think about the future, right, and we think about who's going to be left to stand up for us who's going to be left? And what the Republicans have been unbelievably brilliant at is that the brutality in which they attack the institutions that the broad public relies on, including government itself. The move to contract out, the move to make, even as we expand the role in some ways of our military, to look very critically at how to contract out whole portions of it. And I don't know, as I think about this, I don't know where their agenda ends, but it is certainly in the destruction of government as we know it. And with the new crop of people that they elected, they're proud about it. I mean, you have a group of people who've gotten elected who say, I don't know anything about the Founding Fathers. I don't know how government runs. Here's what I know. What I know is it's too expensive, and we're gonna bust it down. And that kind of bold brutality is something that, as Democrats and the progressive community, it's not even in our DNA, and it sure better get in our DNA, or we're not going to have a government to even argue about. I mean, I think that the aggression on our opposition side is that chilling. But to follow up on that point, your original question is, what does Wisconsin mean? What all of this means is that this is a political attack on the institutions that protect and defend the way our values, fairness, inclusivity, equity, an economy that works for everybody, freedom to choose your partner, freedom to choose over your reproductive rights. All of those freedoms is what is being attacked. And I think if we don't see Wisconsin in that light, we're missing the fact that this is a political move that has huge policy implications.
And of course, Wisconsin is shorthand because what they're doing there is popping up in other Republican and now Democratic communities.
Right, and let's be clear about what Wisconsin is about. What Wisconsin is about is removing the rights for workers to bargain collectively. And what that means is that they are literally stripping the rights of people to bargain collectively, to speak with a group of people and to organize in that way. And that means that we are taking the right away for people to affiliate and people to speak with one voice, with many people to speak with one voice. And that's an appalling attack on our democratic values. And I don't just mean Democratic Party values. I mean values that this country was built on.
Right.
So again, they don't care about the core of that. What this is about who's in charge of government and how small can they make it. Now, that being said, what concerns me is that to see this popping up across the country, and what the Republicans, again, are good at in their brutality is their ability to replicate brutality. And so they're going to big and small states across the country and big and small cities and counties to try to do the same thing. And in fact, we're seeing it here in our own county, which for many of us who know that we live in a relatively progressive community, to see Democratic leaders taking on the Republican playbook and not understand that they're playing, and maybe they do understand that they're playing into a much bigger arena, is really appalling.
And agenda.
Right, and what's appalling about it is, I think we have to be careful about the Democratic Party not creating litmus tests for who gets to be in and who gets to be out. But I think when our core values are attacked, both as a party and again as a country, I think it's important to say especially to our elected officials, on whose authority are you dismantling the rights of people in this community? And do they get to do that by getting to wear the Democratic name? Because it tells voters that their values are one thing when their conduct has been a completely different thing.
Well, and I think one of the insights we had in Wisconsin was that the workers, the unions said, there's a fiscal crisis, we'll stand up and work with you on that. You ask us to give back certain pay and benefits, whatever the details are. The workers say yes, and they go for more. And that is what seems to be replicated, that going for more, as you said earlier, that dismantling of sort of workplace democracy and self-control.
The worst in our state has been in two cities, Costa Mesa, California, and, three, Costa Mesa, San Diego, and now San Jose. And in Costa Mesa, you may recall that a few months ago they fired every worker, and one of the workers actually took his own life upon hearing about that. The mayor of that city went out to a party that night, which is just, it just again shows the insensitivity of dominion, right? Like, we get to have power over these people, and we're going to change our structure entirely so that we don't have to deal with them. And on a playground, we would recognize that as a bully, right? In politics, somehow we don't call it the same thing, but those bullying tactics, those ways of breaking down those structures that have protected workers, and quite frankly invested in change in a whole number of other areas, is a part of an American tradition that I think is so dangerous. We're dangerously close to losing it. Dangerously close to losing it.
What does that mean to the labor movement? The Democratic Party is very partisan. The labor movement has never been partisan. You've worked closely with Democrats because of values, but not exclusively. So how does that play into getting ready for 2012 and what the labor movement will expect of traditional allies, traditional friends?
That's an excellent question. Let me start by saying, and I think this is really important for your viewers to understand. I don't think there's an institution in this country, even internationally, that's perfect. Not faith institutions, not governments, not business, not the labor movement. And why it's important to say that is that we need to be part of the solution. And I think the fact that unions across the country have stepped up and giving back 10%, 15% of their wages and benefits it's not a small thing. I think your point, though, is that the appetite of these elected officials is not getting filled because their budgets are getting balanced. It gets filled when they've destroyed an institution that could later be a threat to them being able to govern. So that's where we're at. Now, as it relates to the labor movement, our values are inclusivity, fairness, economic justice, and it goes down the line. But we are going to be looking for allies who meet those criteria, because we see that there really is that there's a national crisis. I don't know another time in our national history when government leaders, the Republicans in this case, have done more to try to take back rights. I mean, to remove rights from people in this country. We are at a real turning point in our country's history. And that's part of the reason it's so important that your show and other shows like this and blogs and people talking to each other about getting involved is so critical, because when we look back on this time in history, at least when I look back on it and I think about my 10-year-old son, I want to be able to tell him that we were on the right side of history, that we were sticking up for people's rights, their right to bargain collectively, their right to marry whom they choose, their right to have reproductive health rights over their body, their right to have a fair and decent wage, and their right to be educated in a way that's fair and really does lift all boats. That's the side of history we need to be on. And I don't mean from the couch, I mean from the streets. And, at some point, I think it's interesting that so many people in this country are looking at the Middle East and saying, wow, that's so fascinating what's happening over there, people fighting for their rights. We're watching it on TV and not fighting for our rights in our own country.
Well, and we're getting into, summertime, and people generally get into a little lull there. At some point, we thought we were going to have a special election to help determine our fate in terms of funding. Looks like that's not going to happen. What do you see folks doing? What's the labor movement going to be doing over the next few months, over the summertime, and what can people do if they want to support that?
Well, we are doing a lot of marches and a lot of rallies, and part of the reason some of your viewers may not know that is a lot of it hasn't been covered in our local paper. It has been by the electronic media, but I think that people ought to be, I'm happy to give an email address for people who want to get more involved with the labor movement. I would encourage people to get more involved with the party, because it's not going to be summer off, right? We're going to be summer on. We're going to be doing rallies and marches and really educating people about what are the implications of the Republican agenda. I mean, they're brutal. And what's worse is, what are the implications of a Republican agenda being adopted by Democratic leaders in our community? You can look at the city council in San Jose, and probably some other cities as well, to say, okay, well, we've got 10 Democrats, 1 Republican, And how is it that we have some of the most brutal policies being pursued here in this city? And it's really not just about the budget. It is about politics. And it's about who governs in the next, 15, 20 years here. And we want, and let me just say one last thing. As labor leaders, I need the business community to thrive.
Yeah.
And one of the other challenges is that we have, some business institutions here that think, again, that by dominating workers, that's how our economy is going to thrive. I don't ascribe to that model of the economy. And I think, quite frankly, given how much the economy is restructuring now and will be around the world in the next 10, 15 years, that even that approach is old-fashioned, and it doesn't meet what the emerging economy is going to look like. But that emerging economy needs to be value-based, and economies are built on whether or not it's like where we think our values are. What does fairness mean in our country? So.
Right. We have about 30 seconds left. You mentioned an email address. What would that be?
You can reach me at Cindy at the @work.org.
That's simple.
It seems simple.
Well, yeah. Well, you've outlined a lot of important stuff that we'll be working on, and summer on is your key phrase.
Summer on.
Lots to do. Great. Well, thank you very much for being on the show. I know you're very busy, and you have a very active son and need to be spending time there too.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you. Thanks for watching Democratic Television. Give us a call at 408-445-9500 or visit our website, www.sccdp.org. Help make a difference, and we'll see you on the campaign trail.